Hi everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about modus ponens. Then we'll talk about the first premise of the modus ponens, and after that we'll talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. So first, let's take a look at the modus ponens. So a modus ponens is going to be a conditional argument. It's going to have the form. So that's going to be the first premise. If P, then Q. And note these variables, the P and the Q, they can stand for any word, right? So remember the lesson on validity. So these can be, the argument can be valid even if the variables are filled in with strange words. Like if it's raining, then uh, pizza ate my dog, right? That can work as a valid argument, but there's no way that makes any sense. So if P, then Q. The second premise of a modus ponens is P. And what you do at that point is notice that there's a P here in the first line and a P on the second line. And that's important to do. Don't bring the Q down here. Only bring the P. The conclusion of a modus ponens is the Q. So modus ponens reads, if P then Q, P therefore Q. Now, note that P and Q have their place, right? P belongs here, P belongs here, Q belongs here, Q belongs here. This doesn't mean you can't do something like this. You can do that, that's fine. That's still a modus ponens because look, the Q is in its place. The Q belongs here, then the Q belongs here. The P belongs here, then the P belongs here. You can use other things as well, right? So there's M has its place and R has its place. Don't put the R in the M place and don't put the M in the R place when you're doing the modus ponens. An example of the modus ponens, the if P then Q. An example would be if it's raining then it's cloudy. Okay, so then the second premise, hopefully you'll see, would be the P, right? So here, note what the P is. The P is this. Everything before the then, except for the operator, you don't need that. And the Q, then, is everything after the then. So these are your variables here, now identified. So we can say if P, it is raining, then Q, it is cloudy. So we can put down here, and that's the P, right? So it's in the correct spot. So note that it is in the correct spot. And here then we have the conclusion, and this is also in the correct spot. Right? So we have if it is raining, then it is cloudy. It's raining, therefore it's cloudy. So that is modus ponens. Now, why is a modus ponens a valid form? How is it that the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion? The answer to that has to do with the next part of our lesson. It has to do with that first premise, has to do with that conditional argument, or the conditional statement. And that conditional statement, it can be broken into two parts. So the necessary condition and the sufficient condition. So consider again our premise. And notice again, you can break these into their P's and their Q's, right? So we can, let's just identify them. Okay. And then we can make a claim. Okay. Now notice, notice our statement here. If it's raining, then it's cloudy. And it has two parts, rain, clouds. The P here, the part of the arguments represented as P, is going to equal what's called the sufficient condition. The Q there then is going to represent the necessary condition. One way to think, a couple ways to think about the sufficient condition, or one way to think about it is some sort of paraphrase. Okay. Or more thoroughly, in the conditional sense, so we have a sufficient condition can be thought of. So if we say P is sufficient for Q, you can think of P as a guarantee of Q. So you have, if you have P, then it's a guarantee that you definitely have Q. So that's one a paraphrase for. So these are sufficient conditions. Now, what about the necessary conditions? So the necessary condition, and remember the sufficient condition is dealing with P. And the necessary condition, this is going to be dealing with the Q. But the necessary condition here, the paraphrase for that, the paraphrase for this is one it would be required for. So for example, Q is required for P. Okay. So now we have two paraphrases. And we have here dealing with the Q. And then we have here necessary condition. So note, we have with regard to if P then Q, we have the P part here, the Q part here. P part is talking about the sufficient condition, and the Q part is talking about the necessary condition. The sufficient condition can be thought of in terms of a guarantee for something else. The necessary condition can be thought of as a requirement for something else. So, for example, if it's raining, here the claim is that rain is good enough clouds. And we can be more specific about this, it's guaranteed to The existence of rain is a guarantee that their clouds are also actualized, in a relevant area. So the sufficient condition paraphrase, then remember, is it's good enough to guarantee. So here we have the sufficient condition of it's raining, and then we have the necessary condition of it being cloudy. So rain here is represented right there, and it says good enough to, so it has a sufficient condition. Like we can consider this our sufficient condition indicator word or sufficient condition operator word or something is good enough to guarantee. Um, so rain is good enough to guarantee the existence of or whatever clouds. And so that's what that means. And this kind of makes sense too if you have genuine conditions. So if rain really is does have this kind of part-whole relationship with the clouds, then it does seem to have a guarantee. If there's rain, then it has to be clouds. And if there are no clouds, then there can't be rain. So that seems accurate. Um, so here we have if it is raining, then it's cloudy. Talking about the sufficient condition here, and the sufficient condition should be thought of as that rain is a guarantee. If there's rain, it's a guarantee that there are clouds. So rain guarantees the existence of clouds. So note here that the sufficient condition is highlighted. And what it's talking about, when we're talking about the sufficient condition, again, is that which comes after the if and before the then. That's the sufficient condition. And here, the sufficient condition is put into a paraphrase, maintaining the meaning of the operator, or preserving the meaning of the operator, and putting it in a way that's going to ultimately be easier to understand, to defend. The necessary condition. So necessary condition, again, then is dealing with the Q, right? And if P, then Q. So necessary condition in if P, then Q. The necessary condition, again, is dealing with the Q part of the statement if P, then Q. And the necessary condition is all about requirements. So let's consider it in that way. It's all about regulations, requirements. The paraphrase, again, is a requirement for. So Q is a requirement for, or Q is required for whatever P. Okay, so that's the expression of the necessary condition. And this is an expression of the necessary conditions. The necessary conditions relationship to the sufficient condition. What the necessary condition is doing is this part regulates this part to an extent. Where in a sufficient condition example, you have this part being a guarantee of this. All right, so if I remove my marker for a second and we consider this, P is a guarantee of the truth of Q. And the reason might be that one reason might be that Q is a requirement for P. Right? So if I don't have Q, I can't have P. You can think of the P, the sufficient conditions relationship to the necessary condition, as like a guarantee of positive. And the Q's requirement on the P is kind of like it can be used and seen easy as regulating factor. So then the Q here is a requirement for the P. And because it's a regulating functions as a regulating factor, then if P exists, then there has to be the Q because the Q regulates the existence of the P to an extent. One of the analogies I frequently use is, say, consider someone, it's say it's Patty, and say Patty, uh, she always carries around with her the handbag, all the time, every single time, and she never fails to have the handbag. So every time, wherever Patty is, if Patty's there, she has a handbag, and if the handbag's there, then Patty is there. So Patty, so imagine that you find out something true, and say you find out that say Patty is in the room. Well, from this fact, if you know this, then what does that tell you about Patty's handbag? Well, then, right? Now, what if I said to you that what if I said to you that Patty's handbag is not in the room instead of in the room? Right? So if Patty's handbag is not in the room, then what do you know about where Patty is? If that's a hard one, then consider one again. If you know that Patty is in the room, then what do you know about her handbag? We know that since Patty always has her handbag with her, never doesn't have it, then if Patty's there, you know that the handbag is there. Okay, well, what if I said Patty's handbag isn't in the room? Then what do you know about Patty if those other claims are true? Well, then you know that Patty is not in the room. So again, if we look at this again, we say, and consider number one. Imagine Patty is, you know the fact that Patty's in the room. So you know this, and then what that guarantees is the truth of this, right? Because if Patty's there, then her handbag is there. If, but what if I told you that uh, Patty's handbag is not in the room? Her handbag isn't in the room. If you don't have this, then what do you know about this, about Patty? Well, you don't have her either. She's not there either. And so the P there, you can think of it as the P in the if P then Q. The P carries the Q with it. It always brings it with it. If you have that P, then you have that Q. If you don't have that Q, then you don't have that P. So again, what we're doing is looking at the modus ponens again. Remember the modus ponens. Modus ponens is a three-premise argument. Okay. And then the important part of the modus ponens is mostly is premise one. It's telling us what it's doing, and so we want to know, well, why is modus ponens valid, right? And it's valid because the statement if P then Q means that the P guarantees the truth of the Q, and the Q is a requirement for the P, right? So if that premise is true, and number two is also true, that you have that guarantee, then what does that tell you about the Q? Well, it tells you that you must have met all the requirements. Another way to think about this is to think about through another example that also has genuine conditions. So if we say, if I have my driver's license and I passed the written test. Okay, so at least in the state of California, if you have your driver's license and you pass written tests, so far as I know. So if there's some sort of law, let's just stipulate that this is true, but I'm pretty sure it is. Okay, so, well, if this is true, then what if I told you this? My driver's license. If I told you that I had my driver's license, well, then you would know all of a sudden that I passed my written test, right? And the reason now you know is because let me change the color on this pen. The reason that you now that you know this is because this P right here is a guarantee of the truth of the Q, right? So if you have the P, see, we added the P right here. If you have that P, then that guarantees the truth of that Q. And one of the reasons is because that the Q right here, oops, sorry, the Q, that's a requirement for the existence of the P. So if you don't have it, then you can't have the P. So then you know, right? Because if it's there, then you met all the requirements. Just like in this case, then here, look, driver's license. Having a driver's license, one of the requirements for that is that you pass the written test. So if I tell you I got my driver's license, you know, oh, I guess he passed his written test. Good for him. Yeah. Uh, what this is saying again is that having okay. And I know this is awkwardly phrased, and there's more eloquent ways to do that, but let's just get the operators out right now, or the indicator phrases. So what this first part is saying, and the first part is going to be if I have my driver's license, right, the sufficient condition. Well, if we want to express that in a way that's kind of makes sense why the argument is valid. What it's saying is, look, having my driver's license, well, that fact, that's good enough to guarantee that I passed the written test. Okay, so it's a guarantee. Now, in the second part, uh, passing the written test is a requirement for having my driver's license. Uh, and I mean, the subject needs to be me also, right? Me having passed the test. Um, so here, what we're working with instead of the um, sufficient condition, rather, is the necessary condition. So here, we're talking about the relationship that the necessary condition plays with the sufficient condition. And how that plays out is as a requirement for having my driver's license. So me having passed the written test is a requirement for having my driver's license. So if these two things are true, and it's true that you have your driver's license, then it has to be true that you passed your written test. Another thing that's true here is that if we consider this argument, and instead of having the sufficient condition in premise 2, like it should be in a good modus ponens, we turn this into something else. And what this argument does for modus tollens, what this does is it kind of exploits the role that the necessary condition plays in the validity of this argument. So what we do here then is we negate the necessary condition. Remember, the necessary condition is a requirement for the sufficient condition. So here we say I did not pass the written test. Ooh, that's bright. I did not pass the written test. Now, if I do not pass the written test, great. I did not pass the written test. What this is saying is that I did not meet the requirement for having my driver's license. If you don't meet a requirement for something, you can't have that thing if that thing is a genuine requirement, right? A lot of times, for example, you go to, theme parks, and it says you have to be over 5 foot something tall to ride this ride. And depending on the person there, you can get on regardless of your, like almost regardless of your height. Well, that's a requirement. That's not a genuine requirement, right? It doesn't actually play the role of a necessary condition. So what we're looking for is a genuine necessary condition, one that legitimately plays the role of requirement for something else in this kind of way that if it doesn't exist or it's not true, then the sufficient condition has to be false as well. So consider if I have my driver's license, I passed the written test. I did not pass the written test, therefore I do not have my driver's license. And hopefully you can see why this is the case. This is the case because, again, this is the case because the necessary condition plays a role of requirement for the sufficient condition. Remember, if Patty, they deleted Patty, if Patty doesn't, if Patty's handbag isn't in the room, then what do we know about Patty's location? Well, we know it's not in the room. If Patty's in a room, then what do we know about her handbag? Well, her handbag is also in the room. So the P and the Q, they relate to each other in those ways. And because they relate to each other as a sufficient necessary condition, they preserve the truth. So it's saying P is a guarantee of Q. Okay, if that's true and you have P, then what does that mean? You have Q because P is a guarantee of Q. Q is a requirement for P. So if I don't have Q, then I don't have P. And so if that's true and premise 2 is saying that you don't have Q, then you know you do not have P. Because we're saying validity, remember, is if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So in this video, we talked about modus ponens, talked about the conditional statement, we talked about validity a little bit, necessary and sufficient conditions. And the last thing we're going to talk about right now is what statements. And these what statements, I just want to mention them because I'll talk to you about them in other videos. But your what statements then are going to be a translation of your necessary and sufficient conditions into statements like this. So the yellow what statement, so we'll call it what one. Your what statement here is what you're claiming in the sufficient condition. Your what claim here is the what one is going to be represented as the sufficient condition. And so instead of saying if I have my driver's license, I pass written test, you're going to kind of exploit the language there to really show the true meaning of closer to the meaning of what that is trying to get at. So, and you rephrase it using our indicator words. Having my driver's license is good enough to guarantee that I pass the written test. And so that's what the one part of this statement means. And so, so we have, all right, show you what statement number one is going to correspond to your sufficient condition. Your what statement number two, so what it is that the part of the argument is claiming is going to correspond to the necessary condition. And the what statement number two is going to then kind of state explicitly what this is doing over here, what the meaning of this is, or what role it's playing. And to do that, you're just going to use one of the indicator phrases. You'll say, passing the written test, well, that's required for having my driver's license, right? Passing the written test is a requirement for me having my driver's license, whatever we're saying. And so this then, so these are called what statements. So I'm calling them what statements. And the reason why I'm calling them what statement is because I'm asking you, what are you claiming in that sufficient condition? Because after that, then I'm going to ask you to check your conditions for genuineness. And checking your conditions for genuineness is seeing if my necessary condition really is a requirement for my sufficient condition. One way to check for genuineness is to run a modus tollens, one of these arguments, on your modus ponens. So if you said, if I like water, then I like to dance, right? Okay, well, can it be true that someone doesn't like to dance, but they do like water? Yes. Well, if that's true, then your necessary condition isn't genuine. However, if you can run a valid or a sound rather modus tollens, then you've found a genuine necessary condition. But if you can negate the necessary condition in the modus tollens and you do not get a uh, a negation of the sufficient condition, then you do not have a sound or a genuine necessary condition. The same is going to go for the sufficient condition, right? Like if I like water, then I like to dance. Well, so how is liking water a guarantee of liking to dance, right? So that's unclear at the least, right? It doesn't seem to be a genuine condition. But again, way to check to see if it's a guarantee is to check to see the requirements for the guarantee. If it doesn't meet a requirement, and it can still hang around, then you know that it's not a guarantee of that requirement. All right, well, I hope this was helpful. I know this is a bit confusing, um, but I hope it's a little bit clearer for you now. Regulating effect.